So in December of 2000, I had a dream about the White Tigress. And in the dream, I'm sort of backstage at a place like an animal park. It's like Marine World. There's a lot of construction going on. There's hustle and bustle, people and sets being moved. And then I see a white tigress being carried right in front of me. She's on a board, one person in front, one person in back, and she's on her back. And her legs are in the air, and her feet are wrapped very loosely. There's a rope that goes around one foot, and then the other, and then the other, and then the other. And I'm thinking that's not a very good way to tie up a tiger. And she's very angry. She's very, very angry, and she's trying to get free. She's fully grown. She has a huge head and big paws and long tail. So they carry her by me, and then eventually she jumps up onto a platform made out of logs way above me, and she runs away. So I had this dream. Of course, I knew it was a big dream, a very powerful dream. And I even a year later, I worked this dream in dream groups, and themes came up about feminine power, my own anger. And I am Chinese on my mother's side, but all I knew about tigers was that I was a tiger in Chinese astrology. And what I knew about that was pretty much what you get on a placemat in a Chinese restaurant. That's pretty much what I knew. I entered the Indigenous Mind program in 2003. The reason I joined was that I knew I was always meant to tell my family's history. It's going to be an epic movie someday. And at the time that I had the dream, my last maternal ancestor had passed away 6 months earlier. So in 2003, I still didn't know anything about this dream, and entered the program. These are some of the elders that we saw earlier that we learned about. These are, I'm not going to read all of these, but these are the 9 tenets of Indigenous science that Teresa touched on. I'll just read a few of them. Number 4, compared to Western time and space notions, Indigenous science collapses time and space with the result that our fields of inquiry and participation extend into and overlap with past and present. Number 6, Indigenous science is holistic, drawing on all the senses, including the spiritual and the psychic. And my favorite, number 9, humor is a critical ingredient of all truth-seeking, even in the most powerful rituals. This is true because humor balances gravity. So, being in the first residency in Maui, I came back and was starting to learn to recognize the symbols and signs in my waking life, as all Indigenous people do all over the planet. And that was when I finally, when I came back, I learned who the White Tigress was. And I was in a very intuitive state a few days after coming back, and something told me to go shopping. And I said, okay, it sounds really mundane, but I'm going to go shopping. And I ended up in a bookstore, and it was in there that I picked up a book and found out that the White Tigress was a goddess in China. And her name, she's also known as Shi Wangmu. This is an image of her. And she's sitting on the throne of the tiger and the dragon, representing masculine and feminine. And she is the primordial earth goddess of China. And I had never heard of her at all, ever. And as I started reading about what the tiger meant in China, the tiger is actually, it's revered for its power, and it's also very maligned. If a girl was born in the year of the tiger, it was customary to say that she was born the year before or the year after. When I asked one of my teachers to translate a letter, I wanted to write a letter to my cousins and say, what do you know about the White Tigress? They said, you can't ask about that. I said, what do you mean I can't ask about that? And he said, well, a White Tigress is a woman who has sex with men and then kills them. So I couldn't ask about that. Some chamber pots are sometimes in the shape of the head of a tiger with its mouth open. And Shi Wang Mu, the goddess herself, has sort of been demoted over the last 1,000 years to being just, she's the queen mother of the West, but now she's like the wife of the king of the East. So how did that happen? I wondered. So these are my mother's ancestors. On the top left is my grandmother, my mother, and my great-grandmother. And this is me in the middle at the bottom with my mother and my grandmother. And they are from western China, about 2,000 miles inland on the Yangtze River, and just north of Chongqing, which is a very big city on the river. And in my research, I found out that the ancient people of that land were the Ba people, called the Ba people. This is a knife blade, and it depicts a tiger. And the characters have yet to be translated, so I don't even know what they say. But when I researched it, it turns out that the Ba people worship the White Tigress. So the very people of the land of my ancestors worship the White Tigress. The story about the Ba people is that the king went to the land and spoke to the goddess, the White Tigress that was there, and the goddess said, we have all this beautiful tea, rice, silk, let's share it together. But instead the king of the Ba people killed the White Tigress and then wore her skin. And to me, I found a parallel in that sort of with the Athena story, who killed the Medusa but then wore her image on her breastplate. So Medusa being an older earth goddess and Athena being a more patriarchal type of goddess. And so the worship of the White Tigress has been diminishing from, it was very, people were fanatic. There were legions of devotees worshiping her. So what else happened? These are images of the women of the Tang Dynasty, which ended about 1,000 years ago, and these are images that I can kind of relate to. They're kind of larger sized Chinese women. They're active. Some of them play polo. There's other images of them playing musical instruments or dancing. Around this time also was the rise of Neo-Confucianism, and one of the tenets of Neo-Confucianism is regarding women is when she is young, she obeys her father. When she's married, she obeys her husband. When she's widowed, she obeys her son. So in my mind, there's a connection between the worship of Shi Wang Mu sort of going down and the rise of Neo-Confucianism. So what else was happening at this time? Foot binding started around 1,000 years ago, and it started as a fad. These aren't my ancestors, they're representations of people with bound feet. And although I always knew that Chinese women had bound feet, it never, ever occurred to me that my own maternal ancestors, my own female ancestors had bound feet. It never occurred to me. And I only found out after they had all passed away that the last woman with bound feet in my family was my great-great-grandmother. Okay, the next image is kind of graphic. It shows what happens to feet when they're bound. So in my dream, the rope around the tigress's feet was loosening and unwinding, and she gets loose. And she was angry. And interestingly, in my family, my great-great-grandmother, the last one with bound feet, was the only person considered to be really nice in my family. Like, she would never hit the kids or anything like that. And she also spent a lot of her time kneeling, as my family were herbalists, and she would sort and clean the herbs that way. And my great-grandmother on the right was the first one to have big feet. And she was known to be a very cruel and vicious woman. Like, she would if the grandkids had done something wrong, 2 weeks later she'd throw a bucket of water on them in the middle of the night. She was just really cruel. The story of how she was born in 1900, so it was kind of early for her not to have bound feet, and they usually would start at around age 3 to 6. They would start forming the feet, and the ideal foot was 3 inches long. So a grown woman's foot would fit in the palm of your hand. But the story is that my great-great-grandfather didn't bind his daughter's feet, and when the other villagers said that his daughters would never marry, he said, well, I'm rich enough to have unmarried daughters. So I'm really thankful to him, even though I believe that the unbinding has been very painful for the women in my family. Just like there was a time in the early part of the last century where they outlawed foot binding, so they made all the women unbind their feet, and they couldn't walk without the support of the bandages at that point, so it was very, very painful for them. And my grandmother is on the left, and I think this was right when she came to America without my mother, and I imagine this is like their last day, and my mother's crying and because my grandmother's going to leave, and she really found her power through beauty. And you can see her, she looks like a Hollywood glamour woman, just very different. And that I feel like that's what she found her power that way. So the progression is sort of like my great-great-grandmother had bound feet up in the corner, and she was known as a nice person. And my great-grandmother with unbound feet was viciously cruel. My grandmother was a mean person, but less so. And my mother, by her time, that's my mother, I feel was kind of internalizing the anger, and she was bulimic for a very long time. She was in codependent relationships that were very destructive. And that's me. I'm in this line too. So I have big feet. It's funny because, ever since I was little, I always felt my feet were too big. And I do have big feet. We're size 10.5. And I have wide feet. But even in that picture, they look kind of disproportionately large to me. So my desire to bring this dream out to the public kind of started last December when there was a tiger attack in the San Francisco Zoo. And I kind of felt that it's time. I haven't talked about this dream publicly very much, and I just felt like it's time for her to come out. And I'm also dealing with my own anger issues. I'm starting perimenopause and starting to kind of snap at people sometimes out of the blue. It's kind of unusual for me. The tiger keeps coming up for me. In fact, the first night here, Teresa saw a story on Yahoo about 2 white tiger cubs going on display at a zoo in Canada. So I feel like she really came to me. The goddess really came to me. I had no idea it was her until 3 years later, 8,000 miles away from the very land of my ancestors. She's awakening, and she's angry, and she needs to be seen and heard and freed. I feel like a lot of what I do in my life is kind of for my great-great-grandmother who had bound feet. And so I feel like I walk and I dance for her, I run for her, I march in protest. I feel her with me because she couldn't do that. Starting to participate in very short triathlons, and I feel a lot of what I do is because she couldn't do them. And so try to live my life unbound and free. Thank you.